Ignatius Press and the Augustine Institute present The Formed Book Club. Catholic book lovers unpacking good books, chapter by chapter. If you like us, please help us by subscribing and by reviewing us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you might listen. And don't forget to sign up for weekly updates and study questions at formedbookclub.ignatius.com.
Welcome, or hopefully welcome back to the Formed Book Club. We continue to discuss American pilgrimage, a historical journey, or one might say an historical journey, through Catholic life in a new world. We are in the last part of this book, which she has chapters titled Lent, Ordinary Time, and Advent. It's an interesting sequence there. We're now talking about history, which is not history for me, except in very personal. That is to say, we're into my lifetime on this. And I've got more comments because, and I think the three of us will have more comments, because I think it may be harder to summarize or comment on more recent history than it is on more ancient history, because there's fewer studies done and there's less of a time distance and so on. But let's get started. Ordinary time. Lent, chapter 7.
First of all, Father, Joseph, why do you suppose he names this chapter Lent?
Suffering. The church suffering.
Otherwise, there's a lot of bad, a lot of suffering going on.
But I mean, more so than now.
Well, I think he's focusing on that aspect of it in this one, because Advent is more hopeful.
Yes.
Focuses on modern Catholic history in the United States, basically.
Okay, now, so this is a time of suffering. Does somebody want to explain?
Yes, as one of the ones who was suffering at the time he's speaking here, or in some cases not suffering. On page 396, 3/4 of the way down, he says there's far too much emphasis on the 1960s rather than the 1950s. The changes in Catholic life associated with Vatican II were underway in America well before the Council. I found that interesting because I do think the 50s were a golden age in America and the United States in many ways. Not perfect, but nevertheless, as history waxes and wanes, it was a very good time. But then the question, why did it collapse so fast? It was so good in the 50s. Why did it collapse so fast in the 60s? So I do think there's a case to be made for saying, well, there were problems already that maybe not have been as people were not aware of them, but they were there. So that, to me, that piqued my interest.
Yeah, and he does talk about it. I would say one thing here as well. Unlike both of you, their American history for me is post 2001 and pre 2001. So it's obviously once I arrive in the States, I'm very much aware of what's going on here. But prior to that, I'm largely ignorant. So there are loads of things here which would be, you know all about, which was new to me. So I'll be seeing it from a different perspective. But he talks about, and the heading of the suburbs. I think that the cultural aspects of that time of opulence led to, shall we say, a spiritual obesity, which I think psychologically led to the problems of the 60s. I think that we were getting spiritually obese in the 50s.
Well, on page 398, yes, I agree. 398, that paragraph at the top there in the middle, he says television was but the most glaring technological innovation in the larger process of social transformation, calculated to induce tone deafness on matters of the spirit. Could we capture this transformation in a word? The word would be suburbia. Okay, so I want to distinguish there because I do think that all technological progress is mixed. There's value. There's also something you lose. I mean, one image that comes to mind is when we used to walk places, you might meet someone on the path, and talk and say hello or stop at an inn. When you're driving, you leave your little, hermetically sealed home into a hermetically sealed car on the freeway and come to your office, and there's no one in between, really, unless there's road rage. So, in a sense, that the technological innovation of television allowed us to see farther. That's what television means. It's actually kind of a bastard word because telos, meaning far or distant in Greek, and visio is vision in Latin. But it already began a process of, I would say, diminishing personal contact and increasing more distant, less personal contact.
Yeah, I think that someone, I can't remember who this was, someone in the last week read something about people complaining about the radio being harmful to the home, and I think and it's the same sort of thing. I think the TV is even more so. But people are glued either with their ear or their eyes to the device, and they're therefore not actually conversing with each other. So I think that's part of the problem is that people are tuned in to the electronics and therefore tuned out from each other, and I think that's part of the problem.
Vivian, any thought on that?
Well, and yet this very technology is what we're using right now, not in an advanced, as it's developed into video and internet and all these things. But so as father's initial point that technological changes are always a mixed bag. It can be used for good, but it can also introduce other kinds of problems. So
and it's a call for us Christians and anybody too, but I mean, to exercise discernment and a certain amount of moderation and perhaps asceticism when it comes to any new thing that happens.
That's right.
I think I mentioned already in a previous session we had here that years and years ago, partly in the time we're covering now in this book, we had at the university, John Senior came to give a talk. And that was the beginnings of EWTN, Eternal Word Television Network. And I had Mother Angelicus and a crew out there, and they were televising this. This is early mid 70s. And the first thing Senior said was, for all you watching this on television, I have one recommendation: smash your television. Mother Angelica was not very happy with that.
Right. Well, I find this language, just as I find John Senior's advice somewhat extreme. I find this language kind of extreme, that television is calculated to induce tone deafness and matters of the spirit. And just on the page before or so, a few pages before, he was mentioning the enormous impact and popularity of Fulton Sheen's television show, which was on matters of the spirit. So we have a tendency to ascribe bad motives to things when we sometimes see that there can be bad outcomes. You know what I'm saying? And so
yes.
And the same thing with suburbia. I mean, the suburbs, for so many Americans in this era, this was their chance to own their own home. This was their chance to raise families outside of a tenement in the inner city with a garden. And I mean, for a lot of Americans, this level of prosperity after the Second World War was a wonderful thing. But with prosperity and comfort and affluence comes all of these other temptations.
I think the point he's making here, and I agree with you, Vivian, but I think the point he's making is that the in escaping from the, shall we say, the ghetto, the urban ghetto, they entered an assimilated culture where their actual religious identity was lost because it just became generic suburban Americans rather than Catholic Americans. And I think that's the issue I think he thinks is harmful.
Yes.
But you're completely correct that we're so close to this that it's very difficult to be detached from something you were actually involved in personally. So therefore, the author's judgment is going to be touched by, even possibly skewed by, their own engagement personally with what's happening.
Yes, and I want to comment on precisely that. On page 399 at the top, 3 lines down, he says, for Catholics, suburbia represented not a loss of autonomy, but a loss of community, which actually seemed to enhance the possibilities for autonomy. Well, I grew up in suburbia. There was definitely not the sense of a ghetto. We didn't have this anti-Catholic animus, at least I didn't recognize it in my environment. And yet, we had a great sense. Our parish was the center of many of the lives of our neighbors. Not all were Catholic, but the Catholic neighbors. You know, we had parish work days a couple of times a year. We all come together on the parish to do the garden, you know, whatever, clean up this and that. We had a block rosary where we go from house to house each night for the rosary with a different family. There was, you know, altar societies. There was, you know, holy name societies. There was St. Vincent de Paul. There were retreats that were had from time to time. There was certainly a strong sense. So I don't think suburbia by itself destroyed community. It might have destroyed some of the ghetto we against them mentality that maybe prevailed prior to that. But to me, my little experience in Menlo Park, California, was not a loss of community at all.
I would say that part of the aspect of living in suburbia is the necessity to commute to work. So therefore, we have a community that becomes much more oriented to the car and to the commute than was the case before. You know, where you probably worked relatively close, maybe even walking distance from where you lived. So again, that works toward the atomization of community and culture. As you said earlier, Father, you're in your home, you then get in your car, and then you drive, you know, isolated from everybody else to the place of work. And that, I think that's something which is a product of suburbia.
That's true. But there are suburbias and suburbias. And in our situation, my father did drive to work in the morning, 30, 40 miles. But we didn't drive to the church, you know, or to the school. We took our bicycles or we walked. And so the cars did increase distance between the workplace and the home. Mm-hmm. But I understand. I've been in different parishes around the country, and there's a lot of them where you do have to drive to get to unless you want to walk for a couple of hours. But at least in our situation, it wasn't that way.
Mm-hmm. Well, I grew up in suburbia, but not a Catholic. And in my neighborhood where I grew up, there were both Catholic and non-Catholic families. And the majority of the Catholic ones sent their children to the Catholic school after kindergarten. So I hear in my kindergarten class, I had all these Catholics. And then I started first grade, and where were these friends I had made friends even in my own neighborhood? They'd gone off to the Catholic school. But I would say that their sense of identity as Catholics was very strong. And that, I think, was created for them by the fact that their parish did have a parish school. And I was very attracted to their sense of identity and community, and even the way they celebrated holidays. I wanted to be like the Catholic kids. So what started to really water things down was when they started going off to college, because a lot of these Catholic kids I knew growing up, not one of them is a practicing Catholic now. I, the convert, am the practicing Catholic, right? So it's the other things that start hitting the society, as we're going to see as we keep reading this chapter, that I think had far more influence on the severing of ties to the church than did suburbia or even television. I think some of these other cultural winds that we're going to start facing here had a much bigger impact.
Yes, on page 404, new paragraph, he says the new valuation of family life was but one half of the church's mid-century suburban middle-class makeover. The other half was education. Exactly that point. Now, and on page 405, he says, by the way, you were the editor of this book, right, Joseph?
Well, I had an editorial role, yes. I wasn't the I didn't do the copy editing, if that's what you mean.
Okay. Because it's a good book, and I admire what he's done here, and he's a good man. But I have a few, comments on this chapter, which had I been paying more attention, would not have made it into this book. But so page 405, bottom of that paragraph at the top there, the priest was left only with his authority to administer the sacraments, which themselves seem to diminish in importance for their failure to display sufficient technical complexity. Well, what's that all about?
I had the same problem, Father. I was like, what the dickens is he talking about?
Yeah, agreed. And insofar as I should have been more engaged, I will say mea culpa.
Okay. And, this reminds me of during COVID, there were some people who developed these little devices for distributing hosts, like a little, you click on it and the host comes out.
Oh.
No, that's not. One of the beautiful things about the Catholic Church is that it remains attached to bread and wine and oil and water. These are the things that are sacramental. And then you interrupt me whenever you want here, but bottom of that page 405, he talks about Tracy Ellis, whom I met, talked to him, everything. And I remember at this time, he wrote this essay, American Catholic Intellectual Life. At that time, I wasn't reading, but a few years later. Page 406. The essay is nothing less than a full-scale condemnation of the failure of Catholic intellectual in America. I think that was bogus from top to bottom. I was at a Catholic university in 1958, 1962, and we had tremendous professors. I was in engineering student. We had great engineering labs, had a great chemistry professor, had a great physics professor, and of course we had philosophy and theology. And these were, I'm telling you, these were wonderful men. Some laymen, some Jesuits, and I don't know. They place up on this pedestal these so-called research universities. Hey, when I go to college, I want to learn something. I want to have teachers who can pass on the patrimony. And I thought Catholic education, especially Jesuit education in those years, 60s and 70s, was phenomenal. And I couldn't have asked for anything better.
I think the agenda here ultimately is the dehumanizing of education. In other words, to downplay the humanities. And the fact that the Catholic universities were not doing that, because obviously the humanities were at the core of a true Catholic education, was part of the motive for the criticism. There's too much emphasis on the humanities, not enough emphasis on techniques. And I think that's probably the agenda behind it, and that's why they're saying we should be having these research universities. You're going to have a $1 billion budget to be doing research on top of teaching. You're going to be a Harvard, and why does a university have to be that big in order to be able to do all of those things? Why can't it be doing a very good job at educating students?
I think you put your finger on something, Joseph, and that thing is called money. And
yeah,
I found it very ironic, this charge of Catholic universities with anti-intellectualism. One of the reasons why I was so attracted to the Catholic faith was because of its intellectual depth and richness. And in comparison to the blather that you learn in secular universities, which has just gotten worse as time has gone on. But what was really at stake, I think, and I wish I could find a quote because he does mention it somewhere, is that the research universities could get all this money from state and federal granting agencies. And so the competition that was happening was for the money. And so, because, let's face it, Harvard began as a seminary to teach the Protestant clergy of America.
And you had to be able to speak Latin and read Greek to enter.
That's right. And so the Catholics were coveting what the Catholics in academia were beginning to covet what these other universities were able to become by starting to get now all this research money and Nobel Prize winners and all this kind of thing. And so I think they were feeling another one of these Catholic inferiority complexes. But to call it anti-intellectual, to me, doesn't really grasp what the situation is.
Well, it was actually pro-intellectual because what's happened in the 20th century, this is documented very well by Father Gannon in his book we published called The Poor Old Liberal Arts, which I recommended, The Poor Old Liberal Arts. He saw this happening beginning in the 19th century with the influence of German intellectual institutions, that the Catholic program, especially the Jesuit universities, and they were kind of models for the others, was based on the Ratio Studiorum. It was integrated. It was truly a liberal education, even if you took science and things like that. But what happened is, in America, it became the non-research institutions were basically, how do you get a better job, And therefore, you got the multiplication of faculty, social sciences and psychology and business and economics, which are all good things. But the university became a grab bag of disparate faculties as opposed to an integrated place where people took courses that related to each other,
And the irony is, of course, what happens there is that all the people teaching at those universities are specialists who are not able to integrate their own discipline with the broader curriculum. And of course, particularly with the human sciences, the social sciences, if a sociologist does not understand philosophy and theology and anthropology and history, he's going to be bad at sociology. So, these people can't even do what they're disciplined to do because they've been specialized into a box.
And literature.
Absolutely, and literature.
You didn't mention that.
Thank you for that, yes.
But really, the big bomb that hit the universities hard as well was the sexual revolution. And I think that had the biggest factor of all in diluting people's closeness to the church. And he mentions, the birth control, the pill, and then Humanae Vitae. And that's where I think we really start to see people leaving the church because the traditional teaching on these matters no longer seems to be up to date.
Okay, let's move to that, but I want to make one last comment from my part anyway on this suburbia and education. The bottom of page 408, he talks about the Land O'Lakes statement. That was a major statement, 1967. Yes. And I remember reading that thing, and I read the very thing he quotes here. The bottom of the page, he says, the Catholic University must have a true autonomy and academic freedom in the face of authority of whatever kind, lay or clerical. They didn't want to have the magisterium be anything which guided the university. But I laughed at the time. Do you realize what the National Collegiate Athletic Association required of universities?
Yes.
And what Title IX required of universities? Hesburgh is Notre Dame. Don't tell me that he was not subservient to extra academic authorities in Notre Dame. He certainly was. But the magisterium for a Catholic university, you can't have that. I mean, this was hubris. This was arrogance. At the very time, I said, this is nonsense. But of course, I was very prescient at that time. And then on page 409, 5 lines down, Catholic educational institutions would maintain their distinctive character first and foremost through the presence of departments of theology. That's a bunch of nonsense. The whole point is an education is an integral thing. You don't just have everything else, and theology over here as a side note. No, that's, anyway, I'm a little bit, emotional about this because actually I fought against this in 1975 when we started at the University of San Francisco, the St. Ignatius Institute, with the curriculum that had philosophy, theology, literature, history, as well as the sciences integrated,
Yes, exactly. And notice the year that Land O'Lakes thing happened, 1967.
Yeah.
And so we've got the anti-authoritarianism movement in full swing. And I see that as just a piece, whatever pretext they had, well, we're not keeping up to date with science and all this stuff. No, at the end of the day, there was this anti-authoritarian wind sweeping through the church, and a lot of it had to do with the sexual revolution and the Vietnam War. But it was, freedom with a capital F, and we don't want even philosophical restraints, I mean, when they started not just getting rid of the magisterium or whatever, notice how they gutted all the things that you wanted at SI, at the St. Ignatius Institute. You wanted philosophy, and they didn't want that either, did they? The people who fought you.
No, of course not.
Of course not. Can't have people thinking seriously philosophically, or they might draw certain conclusions.
Well, the next section is birth control, which is inaptly named. I wouldn't have that in this book. As Chesterton said, there's no births and lack of control. But I mean, birth control in the sense of living one's life in a virtuous way, and deciding through natural means, what you can do and not do. I mean, that's one thing, but it's artificial birth control or contraception which is the problem. But then
again, Father, to add a mea culpa, if I was more hands-on as a copy editor, that we should have actually changed that subheading to contraception, because that's what it's about. The birth control is a euphemism. Well, we shouldn't use the euphemism, or put it in inverted commas, one or the other, right?
Yes. Well, then on page 411, towards the bottom there, I mean, the previous paragraph, even in an ultra-conservative diocese such as Lincoln, Nebraska, well, ultra-conservative, what does that mean, ultra-conservative? I knew that diocese. I know all the bishops in that diocese. I give retreats to those. It wasn't ultra-conservative. It was just traditionally Catholic. Okay. A priest interviewed in the mid-1990s conceded that his parishioners used birth control about the same rate as everyone else in America. How the hell would he know what the rate was in America and, what the rate was in his parishioners? And notice a footnote, Morris. I knew that guy. He interviewed me for this book, by the way. And I could tell right who's a fraud. Fraud. He was a very liberal thinking historian who slanted everything in his direction. I wouldn't trust a thing that he says, and he's quoted several times in here. So I just want to put, maybe he's more, correct than I am on this, but I just want to tell our listeners and viewers, I would be careful of this guy.
Well, even when they on that same page or close to that same page on 411. Where it says 90% of Catholics have used some form of artificial birth control. That statistic, which you can get from the National Institutes of Health and so on, but when they do these kinds of surveys, it's people who identify in some way as Catholic. It's not necessarily people who are living their faith in any kind of serious or earnest way.
Exactly.
And so what we started to see with this whole period of the church is kind of a winnowing fan of, who are the people who are going to say, let me try to understand why the church teaches as she does, and let me see how living that way really is a life of discipleship in Christ. How can I grow and learn through listening to what the church has to say? And there were just many people who their Catholic identity had nothing to do with any of that. It was a cultural identity, it was a tribal identity, it was and the slightest bit of something going against the grain of the people around them or whatever was just too much. They weren't going to go along.
The one thing as well is about the lies, damn lies, and statistics. Because yes, that's partly true that if those that are Catholic in name but not actually in practice, are obviously not going to be practicing the faith by definition, including its teaching on contraception. But the other thing is the way that's worded there, right? It's really like saying, do you identify as Catholic? Yes. Have you ever sinned? Well, yes. And in other words, that many faithful Catholics might have had a period of their life, right, for 4 or 5 years where they were not doing what they should have been doing. So they're going to be in the box saying 90%, even if they're now living good, faithful lives, right?
That's a really good point. And another thing to keep in mind, he does explain the revolt on the part of the clergy over and over again in this chapter. And Charles Curran being kind of one of the leading spokesmen for this dissent at Catholic University of America, which he continued to teach at until the 80s. And so, a lot of Catholics were genuinely being guided by priests in the confessional and from not the pulpit. No one wanted to talk about it from there, but that, wink, wink, this teaching of the church is not the norm. It's okay if you can't follow it. Let your conscience be your guide. I mean, a lot of lay Catholics were given that advice. They were.
Both those points are exactly right. Because when he says in that quote you mentioned, Joseph, they use some form of artificial in defiance of humanae vitae. What do you mean in defiance? That's like when I sin, it's not in defiance of the 10 Commandments. It's because I'm tempted and I fall. That's
and of those 90% of Catholics, right, especially the non-believing Catholics, how many of them would have heard of humanae vitae to defy it in any case, right? I mean, that's not what they're doing at all, right?
Yeah. And they haven't been really taught the teaching and given practical means by which they can live by it in a reasonable way. And so, I mean, really, a lot of it is just poor catechesis, poor formation, lack of any sort of practical help. I mean, honest to goodness, it's not surprising at all that so many Catholics are misled and confused and yet look how many people later on in life, when they do finally learn and let it sink in, all the remorse they have for, if I'd only known how to do this, I might have, my outcome in my marriage and in my life might have been better.
And the great Catholic conversions of this period,
yes,
like Scott Hahn and Kimberly Hahn and many others, precisely because they saw the beauty and the truth of Catholic teaching.
And that was the last book we discussed, Reason to Believe, with all those philosophers who became Catholics. Many of them actually cited the church's teaching on these issues as being very formative on their own path to the church.
Right.
Page 412 at the bottom, 4 lines up. The Catholic protesters against humanae vitae were the middle-aged parents who produced a baby boom. They were fighting to affirm and protect what they saw as their earlier hard-fought revolution, the achievement of 1950s middle-class suburban democracy. That is a bunch of nonsense.
Yeah.
They didn't. It's Curran who protested. The theologian protested. The priest protested. It wasn't ordinary Catholics at all.
That's right.
There were some, of course, but not. the protests.
There were some, of course. And like I say, there wasn't a lot of practical help given to people who were really struggling.
Yeah.
But that was not the majority of people by any means who were revolting. It was the campuses, and Curran being on a campus, right? That's where the protests were held.
And especially Catholic University of America, which is the bishop's official campus, you know. Here's a sidebar thing on page 413, about 10 lines down. World War II, they were educated in the art of contraception thanks to the U.S. military's wartime campaign to fight the spread of sexually transmitted diseases. Oh, yes. Condoms really help that, don't they? And contraceptives. I mean, the rise in sexually transmitted diseases, it parallels exactly the rise of free sex, contraceptives, and condoms. I mean, that's...
Yeah. One thing I would say there, though, Father, to be fair to the author, he's not agreeing with that. He's merely citing the military's rationale for doing it, even though that rationale is wrong and irrational.
Right. That's true. My only point here is that it was a stupid idea to think you could fight those diseases by contraceptives, you know. Let's see here. You know, on page 454, I mean, he gets into this, I think, false anti-Augustinianism here. He says, 3 lines down, no longer a mere duty. Sex was to be enjoyable. I mean, it's not as if until 1960, the whole Catholic Church believed that sex was merely a duty. I mean, come on, the Catholic Church is a little more practical than that. You know, we understand it. But I mean, that's the narrative of the pre-Vatican II view of sex. I'm sorry.
I mean, nobody ever believed anywhere, let alone the Catholic Church, that sex was a mere duty. I mean, you know, whatever else it is, it's never a mere duty.
Now, we're probably over our time, but I want to keep going on this because we're close to the end of this, and I want to vent some more. Page 416, new paragraph there. But the church had encouraged the laity, especially the educated laity, to move beyond simple obedience. I mean, okay, that's all they had before? I'm sorry. To embrace this teaching, internalize it, make it their own. The same educated laity responded positively to the intervention for deeper reflection, but increasingly looked for guidance outside traditional teaching proper. Don't give me this stuff about the educated Catholic laity that only happened in the middle of the 20th century. Because what would education mean? They went to these colleges where they studied physics, biology, accounting, gender study. Well, they didn't have those gender studies then, but they were somewhat educated and more educated. But I mean, I don't buy this thing that the Catholics in 1920 or in 1890 were not educated. My grandmother's educated.
The great Catholic revival is really from mid-19th to the mid-20th century, which is all preceding this so-called education. I mean, what do we mean by education, right? And being educated. You know, if it means understanding what the church teaches and being part of Western culture and Western tradition and Western civilization, then it certainly isn't true that these people are better educated, right?
Also, the way he talks about these natural methods, I mean, it's really a misnomer to call it a natural method of contraception, because what it really is fertility awareness. In other words, having the knowledge to know when a woman is fertile. And it wasn't based on flawed biology. He actually uses this expression, flawed biology. It was based on correct biology. It's just that over time, as this has been more studied, we've developed better ways of reading biology, right? Like rather than just counting off days on a calendar or some of these other things that people tried. And the way I get the feeling that this isn't his area of expertise. If I were writing this, I wouldn't have written it chosen the language that he chose.
Yes. Yeah.
There's kind of a disparaging going on, probably unintentionally, but in any case, if I read this chapter and I didn't know what I know about Humanity Vitae and natural family planning and fertility awareness and all these things, if I didn't know what I know, I would come away from this chapter with a very skewed view of the Catholic Church, I think, in its approach to human sexuality. And maybe because I converted in the era of Pope John Paul II and his beautiful theology of the body and so on, that maybe I don't really know what it was like in this period. And he's got an accurate assessment and I don't. But listening to Father Fessio makes me wonder whether or not this assessment fits the picture really.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, we mentioned last week or the week before about the fact that the Christopher Shannon had a cursory reading of Rerum Novarum, the Church's social teaching. I think at some aspects of this book, he's not in his comfort zone, and I think it shows. You know, he's an historian, and you know, some of these things he doesn't really know about, and I think on occasions it becomes evident.
I want to insist on which only very, very tangentially related to what we're talking about, but I want to put it on the record for posterity. It was in a conversation with a friend of mine, Father Michael Agliardo, and he came up with this expression. We're talking about gender, you know. Biology is not a state of mind, and I just thought that is a beautiful phrase. Biology is not a state of mind. So let's keep that in mind. All right. I was impressed. I knew this, but to see it all together here, page 418, when Pope Paul VI wanted to have this commission, what were the votes to overturn the church's teaching? 52-4, you know, 9-3 with 3 abstentions, and 14-1. So I think Pope Paul VI, St. Pope Paul VI, had many flaws, but I believe he's a sign of the Holy Spirit acting in the church that against that, the Holy Spirit guided him to do the right thing and maintain the tradition. It was beautiful.
And let's pray that continues to happen with whoever our Pope happens to be.
Yeah, well, I think we will. Now, here's something I want to quote about 3 things on this going forward, but page 419, new paragraph, he says, a vowed celibate teaching at University of Curran was far removed from the experiential agony that inspired dissent on the part. I mean, he keeps mentioning here having children as an experiential agony. I'm sorry. Look, page 420 in the middle. As confessors, they listened to these stories of women suffering from multiple pregnancies and found it suffering from, you know. And then he says, he goes on again there.
Well, keep reading. Suffering from multiple pregnancies and found it increasingly difficult to reconcile their suffering with the image of marital happiness endorsed by the church. Such suffering simply did not jibe with the domestic ideals of 1950s America, nor with the life is worth living cheerfulness of Bishop Sheen at his worst. I mean, this thing is so full of hyperbole.
That's bad.
And you know, here's another, you know, our greatest successes can turn around and be our greatest sources of problems, right? And in this era with better health and for mothers and children, better survival of pregnancy and babies and all of this, health through science. Now women are being encouraged to use bottles and not breastfeed. I mean, these things actually did produce the situation where a woman could be pregnant every year. And, you know, it was the couple-to-couple league. Who were those wonderful people, Father, who started the couple-to-couple league?
John and Sheila Kipley.
Yes, they were the ones who started. When did they come on the scene? They're not mentioned anywhere here, but they were the ones who began to see how some of these other factors were causing, it really was an untenable thing for some of these women to be pregnant so often. But that if they were to breastfeed their children, you have to be careful making these assertions because none of them are ever 100% true all the time.
Right.
But they're just, anyway, the way he writes in this sort of lopsided way on these topics, like I said, if I had read this and didn't know what I know, I would be very turned off by the Catholic Church.
Well, my last quote on this, jumping ahead, on page 425 in the very middle, he talks about lay Catholics that had earlier been lay Catholics to the agony of large families. The agony of large families? Give me a break. Has you ever seen a large Catholic family? That's not agony. That's joy.
Yeah, the happiest people that I know are the parents of large families and siblings in large families. It's just, yeah.
And yet there are those cases where there are very serious problems. And so,
absolutely.
But that doesn't mean you can't take the extreme cases and make out of that the rule, right? I mean,
exactly.
It does seem like, I don't know where he's getting this edge. So it would be an interesting thing to ask him, like, what was his own experience growing up or what? Who knows? I don't know.
I'm just jumping around here, but back on page 420, about 5 lines down or 6, is Catholics wished, in the words of one historian, I think he said, well, I don't know that historian, to nurture an intellectual independence appropriate to a life in a world of affluent professionals. This is, I'm sorry, the vice president of a bank may be a professional, but it's not necessarily an intellectual.
Not at all.
Or someone who's, doing financial advising can be very brilliant, but that doesn't mean he has a sense of human life, and broad and wisdom, So we got a problem that he seems to equate college education, intellectual, development in a particular specialty as wisdom. It's not.
Yeah, again, I find myself playing devil's advocate here, and I completely agree with all that. The agony of large families, that sort of stuff, is just bad, period. But some of this, I think, is where he is not spending the necessary extra subclause or sentence to nuance what he's saying, because he is giving the two sides of the argument. He's an historian here, right? He's actually showing what people were thinking, and that's fair enough. But if he's not careful, it looks as if it's what he's thinking and what he's suggesting his readers should be thinking. But I don't necessarily think, in this case at least, that is what he's saying. I just think he needed the extra subclause and the extra sentence to say this was the current of thought at the time. And just so we know that he's just telling us what people were thinking rather than making it seem as if he has an agenda of his own.
We love you, Christopher Shannon. We're wondering if you're listening or watching. I'm sure we'll find out if you are.
That was a very good
yes.
description, Joseph, of the situation that he's in. He is trying to capture what many people were thinking and saying at the time.
Yeah.
Right.
So we covered suburbia. We covered the sexual revolution. The last section is on sex abuse. A lot of things here which come close to home because he mentions people in this archdiocese. What would I say about all this? Oh, on page 427, new paragraph there, he talks about everything changed in January 2002. Investigative journalists in the Boston Globe began publishing articles based on their research. Okay, so I remember very, very well exactly when this happened, because I was driving down from San Francisco to San Jose to give a talk at Human Life International Conference when the word broke, and I wept. I wept for joy because I and many of my friends had recognized for years what was going on, but nothing was happening. Nothing was being covered up. It wasn't being addressed. And I thought, the Boston Globe hates the Catholic Church, but thank God it's now in the open, because now it can be addressed.
Yep.
It should have been addressed long before that. But
at least it was very, very painful for those of us that didn't know. But once I digested it all, and the shock and horror of the widespread nature of this and epidemic, I was still grateful. Basically, well, if the cockroaches are there, remove the stone, right? And then let's just see them, and we'll deal with it. And the only way you can purge the church of this blight is to know that it is a blight, and to see it, know where it is, and to do something about it. So after the initial shock and horror, because I had no idea, I was completely naive. Then after that, I came to exactly the same conclusion as you. This is happening. Thanks be to God, for the Boston Globe, for removing the stones so we can see the cockroaches.
Amen. Anything else before we conclude this rather long, but I think interesting conversation, if anybody's still listening? All right, well, we'll see you all next week. We're getting close to the conclusion here. This will be 2 more chapters, 2 more sessions. And what have we decided to do after this?
The next book is the Spirit of Liturgy, the Ratzinger.
All right, the greatest book on the Mass ever written, according to my opinion. I won't say it's humble. I won't even say it's correct, but it's mine.
I'm giving you 2 thumbs up for the assessment.
All right, thanks everybody. God bless you. See you later.
If you enjoyed this discussion, please help spread the word about the Formed Book Club by subscribing to the podcast and writing a review. You can sign up for weekly updates at formedbookclub.ignatius.com.